Okay, so what have we seen so far in the first part of our discussion here? We've seen that from the so-called archaic period, when we have extremely small population clusters as a result of the limited support capacity of the environment, that gradually over time, essentially through the evolution of social mechanisms, that the population densities increase. Factors like, for example, the ability to share resources at certain moments of interaction allowed for population densities to gradually improve, or at least increase. And then over the same period of time, we start to see the gradual formation, or at least we can infer the gradual formation of more complex internal social structures, as evidenced by, for instance, the presence of some kind of class or class status, class distinction inside these groups. More advanced mortuary rituals, the burial of the dead, for instance, it seems to become more complex, as well as the emergence of long distance, or at least to some degree, long distance trading networks in a range of high value goods, things like copper and obsidian, shells and the like, suggesting that there were at least a few points, a few axes of exchange that allowed the different groups in the northeastern part of the continent to communicate, right, via trading mechanisms. And that trading mechanism tells us that there was also some kind of incipient, meaning embryonic, beginning kind of market. And from that, we might think a beginning kind of market thinking. So when you pick up a shell, you realize maybe it has trade value. You can exchange it for some kind of worth going forward. That's what we've seen so far. And that's carried us through an extraordinary amount of time. We've covered it in about an hour, but that's about 10,000 years or maybe even more of history of people living in this region. So these changes are taking place at a very, very slow level, or at a very slow pace. The pace of change is very slow because of the very nature in which people are living. And that's not just an environmental consequence, but also the lifestyle. As we noted in our first module, primitive cultures, as we call them, quote unquote, primitive cultures, tend to live largely in equilibrium with their environment. So we don't expect to see any kind of major change over time. Largely, we expect to see the same thing repeated generation after generation. And these 10,000 plus year timescales are what we need then in order to be able to chart changes to the society that take place. So in other words, not an environment of rapid change, but an environment of very slow incremental change. Trigger's central thesis then in The Birth of the Huron, controversial perhaps when he wrote it, but I think widely accepted now, is that when we see the pace of change increasing from what it was before, there's probably some kind of an external event, something happens that's provoked or that changes the dynamic that exists inside the society. And as we finish our first half on that point, the change that he identifies is the move away from a hunter-gatherer into a horticultural environment. So what I want to do in the second half is, first of all, explore the shift that Trigger identifies, why it happened, then to look at some of the consequences of that shift, and finally to look then at the end of our lecture where we promised for the beginning, the end point that we promised, namely, how did the Huron come into being as something that we might identify as a distinct nation, defined not only by the homogeneity of the internal culture, but also the location, where they chose to live, and the kind of lifestyle, the kind of life even, that they were able to practice in that environment. On page 131, Trigger asks a key question at the bottom of the page. What caused the widespread adoption of horticulture at this time? Do we all see that? What caused the widespread adoption of horticulture at this time? As I mentioned in our last class, we have this idea that human beings have wired in their DNA the desire to innovate, to progress, to improve. Insofar as we link moving away from a primitive hunter-gathering lifestyle into a horticultural lifestyle, that seems like a question we don't even need to ask, because we can answer it simply with reference to human nature. We move to horticulture because it's better, and that's what humans do. But as we saw last time, that narrative, in fact, is not consistent with the facts. People lived a very long period of time without moving into horticulture. And even when horticulture was available, as Trigger points out, in this particular instance, and many others beside that we could name, people don't necessarily adopt it. So this notion that it is inherently superior is would not appear to be the right answer. As he says himself, in an important phrase, an explanation, right, that they moved to horticulture simply because it had become available, because cultigens, meaning the plants that you can grow, had now passed from Central and South America into North America, into the northern regions. Now they were available. That is insufficient as an explanation to explain why it was adopted. Availability and application are in this case distinct. As he says, such an explanation assumes that hunting and gathering peoples will inevitably perceive an agricultural economy to be superior to their own and will plant crops as soon as they become available. As you may recall, in the Salins reading, he mentioned that Australian Aboriginal populations rejected agricultural practice as a lifestyle because it seemed to them a lot more work. So they preferred their own lifestyle. So if that's not the explanation, we have to find out. We have to ask. We have to explore this phenomenon from a different perspective. He suggests at the end, some would argue, I believe correctly, that any explanation of the spread of agriculture must take account not only of how suitable crops came to be present, meaning here are the crops that you can grow, but also of those factors in the recipient cultures that predispose their members to accept them. So you need both the crops that you can grow, but you also need people who are willing to grow them. How do we create those two factors? So let's take a look at some of the things that he wants to identify. One argument might be that if you have rising populations, even slowly rising populations, obviously increased population requires not only increased food, but also more reliable food supplies of the kind that horticulture can provide. Generally speaking, rising populations link or correlate directly to food availability. As more food becomes available, you have rising populations. So one explanation might be, well, there were more people, therefore it made sense for them to look for a better form of growing food. The problem with that argument is that primitive, quote unquote, primitive societies have built-in forms of population control, which he mentions on page 133. And I think we saw this also mentioned in the Salins reading, but the idea is that you can control population by simply elongating the birth interval, right? How much time it is between birth. And the simplest way to do it is you simply increase the amount of time that you wean your children. So as you know, breastfeeding inhibits ovulation. Therefore, the longer you wean your children, the longer there is between reproductive periods for females during their period of fertility. So one of the things we find in primitive cultures is very long periods of nursing, very long periods of weaning children, perhaps as up to 4 or even 5 years. Odd as that may sound to our modern sensibilities, 5-year-old children still being weaned by their mothers. But things like that, practices like that, serve essentially as a form of natural population control. So if you are faced with population pressures, there's a built-in mechanism for you to actually reduce those population pressures. As he says, population control was affected by the lengthy nursing of the young, which resulted in small families, and to a lesser degree by war and inadequate care of women in childbirth, although this would be the number one effect, lengthy nursing. Thus, whatever demographic trends were like prior to this period, the adoption of horticulture would have appeared to have created as many, if not more, problems than it solved. There was already a way for controlling for population pressures, in other words. Trigger's argument, which he lays out here at the second part of page 133, he says, my alternative explanation postulates that the seasonal cycle of hunting and gathering peoples of this area pre-adapted them for horticulture. That's an interesting concept. So let's ask what he means by that. A seasonal cycle means that you're already used to thinking of producing, of production, that your economy, in other words, operates according to a seasonal cycle. That there are certain periods when you get your food and certain periods that you don't. Once you move, imagine if you were a full-time hunter-gatherer of the type that we saw explored by Salins in the sub-Saharan band of the Congo. For them, food gathering is a perennial activity. It's something that happens all year round, which means that the social environment is going to be built around a culture that's gathering their food constantly. What Trigger is saying is that for this particular environment, or for people living in this particular environment, the pattern of hunting gathering was already itself cyclical. It was already seasonal. And if, like me, you happen to be Canadian, it's immediately obvious why that would be. Because the country is freezing for about 6 months of the year. And things are buried under, like, I don't know, 6 feet of snow. If you thought the snow we had in Madrid was bad, you should see what it looks like where I come from in winter. You're not doing a lot of food gathering when there's 6 feet of snow on the ground. So in other words, the people who are hunting gathering in this environment were already trained to think, during the summer, you collect the food that you need. During the winter, you wait it out, is the idea. And for Trigger, the idea then is that this, as he calls it, is a form of pre-adaptation. They were already used to thinking in terms of seasonal harvesting, not from foodstuffs that they were growing themselves, but from foodstuffs that were occurring naturally in their environment, but nonetheless built around the same season that we would rely upon, or that they would rely upon in order to grow their food through horticulture, through agriculture. Thus, the idea then is that they were already in a position to be able to exploit the possibilities of agriculture because their social, political, and economic structures inside of the society were already fit that kind of seasonal pattern. Therefore, when foodstuffs became available that pretty closely, if not directly, mapped onto that seasonal structure, plant your crops in spring, harvest them in the fall, it was not particularly disruptive to the society in terms of its existing practices to adopt them. So therefore, they were able to make that transition from a hunter-gathering into a horticultural lifestyle relatively easily. As he suggests further at page 134, this explanation of pre-adaptation suggests that the nuclei of the earliest sedentary villages in this area may have been the hunting bands of an earlier period. So that not only the seasonality of food collection, but the necessary sedentism, you have to stay in one place in order to cultivate your crops and harvest them, that the necessary sedentism was also already in place because of the nature of hunting that these populations had engaged in. And so even though we're still talking about relatively small groups of people, relatively fragmented across this territory, and nonetheless, these two basic elements were in place. A certain kind of sedentism, meaning you're staying in one place, and a predisposition to thinking about food production and food gathering along a seasonal kind of calendar.